I never imagined that buying my dream lakefront property would turn into a full-scale war with the most vindictive homeowners association I'd ever encountered. But there I was, standing in my new living room with boxes stacked to the ceiling, when I heard the aggressive pounding on my front door that would mark the beginning of the most satisfying revenge story of my entire life. My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm a 38-year-old software engineer who had spent the last 15 years working 70-hour weeks in Silicon Valley, saving every penny I could to eventually buy a piece of paradise where I could work remotely and actually enjoy life for once. The property I found was absolutely perfect, a beautiful 3-bedroom cottage on the shores of Lake Serenity, a pristine body of water about 2 hours north of the city, surrounded by pine forests and mountains that looked like something out of a postcard. The house itself was a charming A-frame structure built in the 1970s, with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the water, a wraparound deck, and direct access to the lake. But here's where things get interesting, and this is the detail that the HOA would come to regret overlooking. The property came with something extremely unusual and valuable. When I was doing my due diligence before purchasing, my real estate attorney noticed something peculiar in the property deed that dated back to 1923. Long before the neighborhood was developed into the wealthy enclave it had become. The original owner of my land, a man named Theodore Blackwood, had been a timber baron who owned most of the lakefront property in the area. In 1923, he sold off parcels of his land to various buyers, but he retained ownership of a crucial piece of infrastructure, large dock system and boat launch that serviced the entire western shore of the lake. Over the decades, as properties changed hands and the area developed, this dock system became the primary access point for all the residents in what eventually became the Serenity Lake Estates community. Here's the kicker. Through a series of inheritance quirks and legal oversights, the ownership of those docks never transferred to the HOA or became common property. Instead, it remained attached to the original Blackwood estate land, which through various sales and subdivisions, eventually became the property I was purchasing. My attorney was absolutely giddy when he discovered this, explaining that I would technically own the dock system that serviced approximately 140 homes in the HOA community, even though my property wasn't actually part of the HOA itself due to its pre-existing status. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson who had inherited the property from her grandfather, had been letting everyone use the docks freely for decades, never enforcing her ownership rights because she was a kind soul who believed in community cooperation. I had every intention of following her example because I'm not naturally a vindictive person, and I genuinely wanted to be a good neighbor. When I closed on the property in late April, I was over the moon with excitement. I spent the first few days just walking around in disbelief that this beautiful place was actually mine, watching the sunrise over the lake from my deck, planning where I'd set up my home office, and imagining all the peaceful mornings I'd spend kayaking before starting my workday. The neighborhood seemed quiet and upscale, with well-maintained properties and mature landscaping. I noticed the dock system that I now owned, a large floating dock structure with slips for about 50 boats, a boat launch ramp, and a fish cleaning station. Everything looked well-maintained, and I figured the HOA must have been taking care of it, which was fine by me. I was planning to draft some kind of informal agreement to make the arrangement official and ensure the docks stayed properly maintained. That was before the HOA invaded my life like a swarm of locusts with clipboards. On my third day in the house, I was in my living room attempting to assemble a bookshelf when I heard that aggressive pounding I mentioned earlier. When I opened the door, I was confronted by 3 people who radiated the kind of self-important energy that makes you instinctively take a step back. The leader of this delegation was a woman in her early 60s named Patricia Holbrook, who introduced herself as the HOA president with the kind of authority usually reserved for heads of state. She was flanked by 2 other board members, Gerald Hutchins, the vice president, who had the demeanor of a retired military officer with control issues, and Sheila Morrison, the architectural review committee chair, who looked at my house like it had personally offended her grandmother. Patricia didn't even wait for me to invite them in before she started talking, consulting a tablet she carried like it contained the secrets of the universe. She informed me in a tone that brooked no argument that, as a resident of Serenity Lake Estates, I was required to comply with their HOA regulations, which were extensive and apparently non-negotiable. I tried to politely explain that according to my deed and my attorney's research, my property predated the HOA and wasn't actually subject to their covenants. But Patricia cut me off with a dismissive wave that immediately made my blood pressure rise. She insisted that regardless of what my little lawyer might have told me, The community had standards that everyone followed, and I would be no exception. What followed was a litany of complaints and demands that grew more absurd by the minute. Apparently, my moving truck had been parked in my driveway for more than the allowed 4-hour window for service vehicles, which I would be fined $200 for. The flowers that the previous owner had planted in the front yard were not on the approved plant list, and would need to be removed and replaced with approved species at my expense. My mailbox, which was a charming rustic wooden post that had been there for at least 30 years, did not match the approved neighborhood aesthetic and would need to be replaced with a standard black metal mailbox that cost $400 from their designated vendor. The shutters on my house were painted forest green, but the only approved shutter colors were colonial blue, burgundy, or cream, so I'd need to repaint them. My outdoor lights were motion-activated LED fixtures, but the HOA only allowed warm-tone Edison bulbs in vintage-style fixtures. The list went on, and with each new demand, I felt my initial friendliness evaporating like morning dew in the desert sun. I took a deep breath and tried again to explain that my property wasn't part of the HOA, showing them the documentation my attorney had prepared. Gerald actually laughed, a condescending chuckle that made me want to throw my half-assembled bookshelf at him. He informed me that they'd dealt with the previous owner's confusion about this matter, and that Mrs. Patterson had eventually understood that, while her property might have some grandfathered status, the spirit of community meant following the rules. Sheila chimed in with a pointed comment about how Mrs. Patterson had been a wonderful neighbor who understood the importance of property values, the implication being that I clearly did not. That's when Patricia dropped the real bomb. She informed me that because my property had direct lake access with a private beach area, and because the community docks were located near my property line, one was required to maintain a buffer zone of natural vegetation, remove my small boat dock that extended from my beach, which had been there since the 1970s, and refrain from any loud recreational activities on my section of beach before 10 a.m. or after 6 p.m., including kayaking, because apparently the sound of a paddle disturbing water was disruptive to the tranquil lake atmosphere. This was particularly rich coming from people whose neighborhood regularly hosted loud pontoon boat parties that I'd already heard echoing across the lake. When I tried to argue that these restrictions were ridiculous and possibly illegal as they pertained to my use of my own property, Patricia's eyes went cold. She informed me that if I chose to be difficult, the HOA had significant legal resources and would make my life extremely unpleasant. They had successfully driven out 3 other non-compliant homeowners over the past decade, forcing them to sell at a loss. She actually smiled when she said this, like she was proud of bullying people out of their homes. Gerald added that it would be a shame if I found myself constantly cited for violations, if my property became the subject of frivolous legal actions, and if the neighborhood became less welcoming to me and any guests I might have. It was at that moment, standing in my doorway being threatened by these 3 petty tyrants, that something shifted in my mind. I'm generally a conflict-avoidant person who goes along to get along, but there's a limit to how much anyone should have to tolerate, and these people had just pole vaulted over that limit. I smiled at them, a genuine smile, because a beautiful realization was crystallizing in my mind. I thanked them very politely for stopping by and told them I'd give their concerns the consideration they deserved. The sarcasm sailed right over their heads, and they left looking satisfied that they'd put the new guy in his place. The moment their car pulled out of my driveway, I called my attorney, James Wu, who had handled my property purchase. After I filled him in on what had just happened, there was a long pause on the line, and then James started laughing so hard I thought he might hurt himself. When he finally caught his breath, he said 5 words that would change everything. "Marcus, you own their docks." See, I'd known I technically owned the dock system, but I hadn't really processed the implications. James explained it to me like I was 5 years old. The entire Serenity Lake Estates community, all 140 homes, had only 3 ways to access the lake with their boats. There was the main dock system with the boat launch, which I owned. There was a smaller dock on the eastern shore that could fit maybe 10 boats and had no launch ramp, which the HOA owned. And there was a public boat launch about 7 miles down the road at the county park, which charged a daily launch fee and was often crowded during summer weekends. The dock system I owned was the lifeblood of the community's property values. These were luxury lakefront homes, many of them worth over $1 million, and a huge part of their value was the convenient lake access. Without the docks, residents would have to either fight for space at the tiny HOA dock, drive to the county launch every time they wanted to use their boats, or install private docks at their own properties. which would require individual permits and could cost $15,000 to $30,000 each. Moreover, the HOA didn't have the space or infrastructure to build an alternative dock system on their common property. The geography of the lake and the way properties were distributed meant that my dock location was uniquely suited for its purpose. James explained that Mrs. Patterson had apparently never formalized any agreement giving the HOA rights to use the docks. She'd just let them use it out of kindness, and over the decades, the HOA had come to think of it as theirs, even spending HOA funds to maintain it. But legally, it was mine, all mine, and I could revoke access whenever I wanted. The gears in my head started turning. I asked James what would happen if I simply closed the docks to everyone except myself. He said that legally, I was absolutely within my rights to do so. The HOA could try to sue for some kind of prescriptive easement, claiming they'd used the property openly and continuously for so long that they'd earned rights to it. But James doubted they'd succeed because Mrs. Patterson's permission, even if informal, had been permissive use, which doesn't lead to prescriptive easements. Plus, I'd only owned the property for 3 days, so any such lawsuit would take years to resolve, during which the docks would be essentially useless to them if I chose to lock them down. I spent the rest of that day doing research. I looked up the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, which were a nightmarish 147-page document filled with petty regulations about everything from the exact height grass could be no taller than 2.5 inches to the specific breeds of dogs that were prohibited, including, bizarrely, I researched the members of the HOA board and discovered that Patricia, Gerald, and Sheila were notorious in local social media groups for their aggressive enforcement and their tendency to target anyone who didn't fit their vision of the ideal community. I found posts from former residents who described being harassed with constant violation notices, subjected to special assessments that seemed designed to punish them, and in one case, being falsely reported to code enforcement for violations they hadn't committed. These were not nice people, and they'd been using the HOA as their personal fiefdom for years. I also discovered something interesting. The HOA's budget, which was part of the public record, they collected substantial monthly dues from all residents, and a line item in their budget showed $18,000 annually for dock maintenance and operations. They'd been spending money to maintain my property without actually having any legal right to it. This gave me an idea for how to proceed. The next morning, I had James draft a formal letter to the HOA. The letter was professional, cordial, and absolutely devastating. It informed them that I was the legal owner of the dock system they'd been using, attached documentation proving this fact, and notified them that effective immediately, they were trespassing on my property. However, the letter continued. I was willing to grant them a license agreement to continue using the docks, but this would require a formal contract with terms we'd need to negotiate. The letter concluded by noting that any attempt to interfere with my property rights, including but not limited to harassment through frivolous HOA violations, would result in immediate revocation of dock access and potential legal action for trespass and harassment. James emailed the letter to the HOA board on a Friday afternoon. I spent that weekend watching from my deck as board members drove down to the dock area, examined the property boundary markers, took photos, and had what appeared to be increasingly agitated conversations on their cell phones. It was immensely satisfying. On Monday morning, Patricia called me. Her tone had transformed from commanding to carefully controlled civility. She suggested we meet to discuss the dock situation and to clear up any misunderstandings. I agreed to meet with the full HOA board at the community clubhouse that evening. When I arrived at the meeting, the contrast with our first encounter was stark. Patricia, Gerald, and Sheila were joined by 2 other board members I hadn't met, Howard Chen, the treasurer, and Lisa Yamamoto, the secretary. They were all seated on one side of a long table, and they'd placed a single chair on the opposite side for me, like I was about to be interrogated. The power play was obvious and kind of pathetic. Patricia started by trying to establish a friendly tone, saying how wonderful it was that we could work together as neighbors. She explained that the dock had been a community resource for as long as anyone could remember, and while they appreciated that there might be some technical legal complications, surely we could come to a gentleman's agreement that preserved the status quo. Gerald jumped in to mention that the HOA had been maintaining the docks at significant expense for years, and that this certainly gave them some moral right to continue using them. Sheila added that disrupting dock access would be devastating to property values and would hurt everyone in the community, including me. I let them finish their pitch, nodding along politely. Then I pulled out my own folder of documents and laid out my position. First, I acknowledged that they had indeed been maintaining the docks, which I appreciated. However, this didn't grant them legal rights to my property any more than mowing your neighbor's lawn gives you ownership of their yard. Second, I agreed that we should formalize an arrangement, but it would need to be on terms that properly compensated me for the use of my valuable property and protected me from harassment. Third, I noted that my property was not subject to their HOA covenants, and any attempt to enforce such covenants against me would be met with legal action and would immediately terminate any dock access agreement. Patricia's carefully maintained friendly expression started to crack. She said that she thought I was being unreasonable and that this is how we do things in this community. I smiled and responded that I was being perfectly reasonable, was offering to continue allowing them to use my property, just under proper legal terms. If that didn't work for them, I was happy to simply close the docks and use them exclusively for myself. The room got very quiet. Howard, the treasurer, who seemed like he might be the only reasonable person on the board, asked what terms I had in mind. I laid it out for them. First, they would immediately cease any and all attempts to apply their HOA rules to my property. They would put in writing that my property was not subject to HOA covenants and that I was free to use and modify my property as I saw fit, within local zoning and building codes. Second, they would pay me a reasonable license fee for use of the docks. I'd calculated that 140 homes sharing access to a dock system that would cost probably close to $2 million to replicate should each pay about $100 per month, or $1,200 per year. This would generate $168,000 annually, which seemed fair given the value they were receiving. However, I was willing to be reasonable and charge only $50 per month per household, or $84,000 per year. This was, after all, far less than it would cost them to build alternative docking facilities or for each homeowner to install their own dock. Third, the HOA would be responsible for maintaining the docks to a standard we'd agree upon in writing, with annual inspections to ensure compliance. Fourth, I would retain the right to terminate the agreement with 90 days' notice if the HOA violated any terms, including the prohibition on harassing me. Fifth, the agreement would include a clause stating that if I sold my property, the dock rights would transfer to the new owner under the same terms, preserving the value of my property. The reaction was explosive. Patricia turned red and started sputtering about extortion and how I couldn't possibly expect them to pay such outrageous fees. Gerald called me a greedy SOB who was trying to exploit the community. Sheila actually stood up and said she'd make sure everyone in the neighborhood knew what kind of person I was. Lisa, the secretary, looked uncomfortable but stayed quiet. Howard looked like he was doing mental math and wasn't happy with the results. I let them vent for a minute. Then I calmly explained that my offer was extraordinarily generous. If each of the 140 homeowners wanted to install their own private dock, they'd spend between $15,000 and $30,000 each, for a total community cost of $2.1 million to $4.2 million. My proposed fee of $600 per year per household was less than what many marinas charged for boat slips, and it was tax-deductible as a property expense. Moreover, the alternative was that I simply close the docks entirely, which would immediately hurt all their property values. I wasn't extorting anyone. I was offering a fair price for a valuable service using property I owned. Patricia tried a different tack, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She said that perhaps I didn't understand how things worked in a close-knit community like theirs. They looked out for each other, they cooperated, they didn't try to profit off their neighbors. If I insisted on being difficult, I might find that community spirit didn't extend to me. People might not be friendly. I might find myself excluded from neighborhood events. My trash cans might get knocked over. My car might get scratched in the community parking areas. It was a transparent threat, and it was also the biggest mistake Patricia had ever made in her life. I pulled out my phone, stopped the recording app I'd had running in my pocket, and informed the board that I'd just recorded Patricia threatening me with harassment and property damage if I didn't give up my legal property rights. I said loudly and clearly that I would be providing this recording to my attorney and potentially to law enforcement if any such incidents occurred. The color drained from Patricia's face. Gerald looked like he wanted to leap across the table at me. Howard put his head in his hands. I stood up and said that my offer would remain open for exactly 7 days. They could agree to my terms, or they could find themselves locked out of the docks and dealing with a very expensive legal battle that they would lose. I walked out of that clubhouse feeling like I was floating on air. The next few days were interesting. I started noticing cars driving slowly past my house at odd hours, and I'm pretty sure Gerald drove by at least 3 times a day, glaring at my property like he could burn it down with his eyes. I installed security cameras covering all angles of my house and property because I wasn't about to let these petty tyrants vandalize my home without evidence. I also spent time down at the docks, which were still technically open since I hadn't formally closed them yet. I chatted with residents who were launching boats or returning from fishing trips, and I discovered something interesting. Most of the community had no idea about the dock ownership situation. They'd been paying their HOA dues, which included the dock maintenance fee, and they assumed the docks were HOA property. When I casually mentioned that I actually owned the docks, the reactions were mixed. Some people were shocked, some were curious about how that had happened, and a few were concerned about what it meant for their lake access. I was always careful to be friendly and to explain that I wanted to work out a fair arrangement, but that the HOA board was being difficult. By Wednesday, I started getting phone calls from individual homeowners. The word was spreading through the neighborhood, and people were worried. A few angry callers accused me of trying to rip off the community, but most were more concerned and wanted to understand what was happening. I patiently explained the situation to each caller. I owned the docks. The HOA had been using them without a formal agreement. I wanted to formalize the arrangement with a fair license fee, and the HOA board was refusing to negotiate reasonably. I made sure to mention that my proposed fee of $50 per month was far less than the alternatives and that I was being quite generous. Several homeowners expressed frustration with the HOA board, saying that Patricia and Gerald had a reputation for being difficult and for making decisions without properly consulting the community. One woman, Jennifer Martinez, who lived 3 houses down from me, stopped by in person on Thursday evening. She was in her early 40s, worked as a project manager for a tech company, and had been dealing with the HOA board for 5 years. She told me that Patricia had been HOA president for 8 years and ran the association like her personal kingdom. The board held meetings that technically complied with state HOA laws, but were scheduled at inconvenient times and were structured to minimize community input. When people questioned board decisions, they often found themselves targeted with increased scrutiny and violation notices. Jennifer herself had been fined multiple times for violations that other homeowners routinely got away with, simply because she dared to question a special assessment. She said that many homeowners were fed up with the board but felt powerless to change things because the board had structured the that to make it very difficult to recall board members or to override their decisions. She asked what she could do to help resolve the dock situation, and I suggested that concerned homeowners should start attending HOA meetings and demanding accountability. I also mentioned that if the board continued to refuse my reasonable offer, individual homeowners might want to consider whether their board was really acting in their best interests. On Friday, exactly 7 days after my ultimatum, I received an email from the HOA's attorney, a lawyer named Richard Pemberton from a firm that specialized in HOA law. The email was a masterpiece of legal posturing, claiming that my ownership of the docks was disputed, that the HOA had a valid prescriptive easement through decades of continuous use, that my demands constituted extortion, and that if I proceeded with my threats to close the docks, the HOA would pursue all available legal remedies, including lawsuits for damages to property values and injunctions to maintain access. The email concluded by offering a compromise. I would grant the HOA a permanent easement to use the docks in exchange for $10,000, and I would agree to comply with all HOA covenants as a condition of residing in the community. I forwarded the email to James, who responded within an hour with his own letter to Pemberton. James's letter was a thing of beauty, systematically demolishing every argument in Pemberton's email. He cited case law showing that permissive use doesn't create prescriptive easements, pointed out that I'd owned the property for less than 2 weeks, so any continuity of use claim was moot, noted that offering to sell access to my own property at fair market value isn't extortion, and explained that my property's pre-existing status meant it wasn't subject to HOA covenants. James concluded by reiterating that my offer stood $50 per month per household, no HOA covenant enforcement, or the docks would close on Monday morning and wouldn't reopen without a signed agreement. That weekend was a turning point. On Saturday morning, I woke up to find my driveway blocked by a huge truck. When I went outside to investigate, Gerald was standing there with a smug smile, informing me that the truck was there to make a delivery to his house and would be parked in my driveway for the next several hours, because his driveway was being resurfaced. This was clearly retaliation, an attempt to intimidate me and make my life difficult. I smiled at Gerald, took several photos of the truck and his license plate, and then called a towing company. I explained that there was an unauthorized vehicle blocking my private driveway and I needed it removed immediately. Gerald's smug expression disappeared when the tow truck arrived 20 minutes later. He started yelling about how I couldn't tow his vehicle, how this was a neighborhood where neighbors helped each other, and how I was going to regret this. I calmly informed him that he was trespassing on my property, that I had photos and security camera footage of his deliberate obstruction of my driveway, and that if he didn't move his truck immediately, I would not only have it towed at his expense but would also add this incident to the growing list of harassment examples my attorney was documenting. The truck was moved within 5 minutes. By Saturday afternoon, my phone was ringing constantly. Homeowners were freaking out because the HOA board had sent out an emergency email blast announcing that due to a legal dispute, dock access might be suspended starting Monday and that all residents should prepare for potential disruption to lake access. The email painted me as an unreasonable outsider trying to extort the community and urged residents to support the board in fighting my outrageous demands. However, the email also included enough details about the situation that people could read between the lines, and many of them were doing the math and realizing that the board was screwing this up. By Sunday, there was a full-blown revolt happening within the HOA. Jennifer Martinez had organized an emergency meeting of concerned homeowners at the community clubhouse, and about 60 people showed up. I was invited to attend and explain my position. I brought documentation showing my ownership of the docks, a breakdown of my proposed fee structure compared to alternatives, and copies of all the correspondence including Patricia's threats. I laid out the entire situation, from the HOA board storming into my house on day 3 to make ridiculous demands, to their attempts to intimidate me, to their refusal to negotiate reasonably. I explained that I was willing to be a good neighbor and allow continued dock access, but only under proper legal terms that protected me from harassment. The reaction was overwhelmingly supportive. People were angry at the board for mishandling the situation, for threatening me, and for putting the entire community's lake access at risk over their desire to control me and avoid paying a reasonable fee. Several homeowners pointed out that $50 per month was a steal compared to marina fees or the cost of installing private docks. Others expressed frustration that the board had never bothered to secure legal rights to the docks all these years, leaving the community vulnerable to exactly this situation. One retired attorney named George Feldman pointed out that if the board had simply been cordial to me from the start and approached the dock issue professionally, we probably could have worked out a very favorable arrangement, but their aggressive tactics and threats had poisoned the well and forced me to protect myself with strict contractual terms. The meeting resulted in a petition signed by over 50 homeowners demanding that the board accept my offer and formalize the dock agreement. The petition also called for a special election to recall Patricia, Gerald, and Sheila from the board and replace them with members who would act in the community's genuine best interests. Monday morning arrived, and I received a call from Howard, the treasurer, who I'd correctly identified as the only reasonable person on the board. He sounded exhausted. He explained that the board had held an emergency meeting Sunday night after the community meeting, and it had been a disaster. Patricia had wanted to fight, to refuse my terms and sue me. Gerald had suggested they try to have me arrested for extortion, which Howard had explained was insane. Sheila had proposed organizing a boycott of my property, whatever that meant, but Howard and Lisa had pointed out that they were facing a community in open rebellion, that they had no legal leg to stand on regarding the docks, and that continuing to fight me would result in the recall of half the board and would still end with them having to accept my terms or worse. After hours of argument, they'd finally taken a vote, 3-2. They'd agreed to accept my offer. Howard asked if I would be willing to meet to finalize the agreement. I agreed, but I insisted that my attorney be present and that we meet on neutral ground at James's office. That afternoon, I sat in James's conference room with Howard and Richard Pemberton, the HOA's attorney. Patricia had wanted to attend, but Howard had persuaded her that her presence would be counterproductive given her tendency to escalate conflicts. We hammered out the details over the course of 3 hours. The final agreement included everything I'd asked for: acknowledgement that my property wasn't subject to HOA covenants, a license fee of $50 per month per household, HOA responsibility for dock maintenance, my right to terminate with notice for violations, and portability of the agreement to future owners. We also added some additional terms that actually benefited everyone. I agreed to maintain basic liability, insurance on the docks, and to give reasonable notice before making any major modifications. The HOA agreed to install better lighting and security cameras in the dock area to prevent vandalism and theft, and we established a joint committee of 3 residents and myself to handle any dock-related issues that arose. The agreement would run for an initial term of 10 years with automatic renewal unless either party gave notice of termination. The license fees would be collected as a separate line item in HOA dues, with the first payment due within 30 days. By Wednesday of that week, exactly 2 weeks after I'd moved in, the agreement was signed, notarized, and recorded with the county. I'd won completely, the docks remained open, I was receiving fair compensation for the use of my property, and I was protected from HOA harassment. But the real victory was yet to come. The recall petition that had been started after the community meeting gained steam rapidly. Jennifer Martinez and George Feldman organized the effort, gathering signatures and documenting all the complaints that homeowners had accumulated over years of Patricia's regime. It turned out that when people weren't afraid of retaliation, they had a lot to say about the board's mismanagement. Within 6 weeks, they had enough signatures to force a special election. The recall vote was scheduled for late June, and the campaign was intense. Patricia, Gerald, and Sheila fought desperately to hold on to their positions, sending out newsletters claiming they'd been protecting the community from my extortion, and had negotiated the best possible deal. But Jennifer's group countered with the actual facts, that the board's aggression and threats had created the conflict in the first place, that my final terms were actually quite reasonable, and that the board had a long history of bullying residents and mismanaging community resources. On the night of the vote, the community clubhouse was packed with homeowners. The results weren't even close. Patricia, Gerald, and Sheila were all recalled by margins of more than 70%. New board members were elected. Jennifer became the new president, George Feldman became vice president, and 3 other reasonable people filled out the board. Howard stayed on as treasurer because everyone agreed he'd tried to do the right thing. The new board was a revelation. They immediately began reviewing and revising the HOA's ridiculous rules, eliminating the most petty and restrictive covenants. The 147-page rulebook was condensed to a reasonable 30 pages focused on genuine community concerns like property maintenance standards and noise ordinances, rather than dictating what colors people could paint their shutters or what types of mailboxes they could have. They restructured meetings to be more accessible and to actually welcome community input. They ended the practice of targeting specific residents with excessive violation notices. Under the new leadership, the community began to feel like an actual community rather than a dictatorship. As for me, I settled into my lakefront paradise and actually got to enjoy it. I set up my home office with a view of the lake, took up kayaking like I'd planned, and even bought a small sailboat that I kept at the docks I owned. I became friendly with many of my neighbors, hosting occasional barbecues on my deck and participating in community events. The dock license fees provided a nice supplemental income stream that helped cover my property taxes and gave me extra security. I even used some of the money to make improvements to the docks that benefited everyone, installing better boat lifts and renovating the fish cleaning station. Patricia, Gerald, and Sheila largely disappeared from community life after their recall. I'd occasionally see them driving through the neighborhood, always looking sour, but they never bothered me again. Gerald actually moved away about a year later, selling his house at a loss because apparently he couldn't stand living in a community where he didn't hold power over everyone. The story of the HOA that didn't know I controlled their docks became something of a legend in local property rights circles. James used it as a case study when teaching seminars on title research and property rights. I was even invited to speak at a homeowners' rights conference about standing up to abusive HOAs. Though I emphasized that I'd never wanted conflict, I'd just wanted to be left alone to enjoy my property, and I'd been forced to defend myself against bullies. Looking back on the whole saga now, 3 years later, I sometimes reflect on how differently things could have gone. If Patricia and her cronies had simply been decent human beings when I moved in, if they'd welcomed me to the neighborhood and approached the dock situation with respect and good faith, I probably would have let them continue using the docks for a nominal fee or maybe even for free, with just a simple written agreement protecting my legal rights. I'm not a greedy person, and I genuinely believe in being a good neighbor, but their aggression, their threats, their assumption that they could bully me into submission, and their complete disregard for my property rights transformed me from someone who wanted to be accommodating into someone who was willing to use every legal tool at my disposal to protect myself and teach them a lesson about consequences. The most satisfying part wasn't the money from the dock fees, though that was nice. It wasn't even winning the legal battle, though that felt good. The most satisfying part was watching a community liberate itself from petty tyrants and transform into a genuinely pleasant place to live. The new HOA board actually serves the community's interests rather than wielding power for its own sake. Neighbors help each other out instead of living in fear of violation notices. Property values have actually increased because the area has a reputation now for being well managed and neighborly rather than oppressive. And I get to enjoy my morning coffee on my deck, watching the sunrise over the lake, with my kayak waiting for me at my docks, knowing that standing up to bullies was absolutely the right choice. Sometimes you move to a quiet lakefront property expecting peace and tranquility, and instead you get war. But if you're strategic and you know your rights, you can turn that war into the most satisfying victory of your life. And that's exactly what happened to me in ways I never could have imagined during those first chaotic weeks. The months following the recall election brought changes that rippled through the entire community in ways both expected and surprising. Starting with Patricia's complete meltdown at the first HOA meeting after her removal from the board, an event that became instant neighborhood legend and proved that karma was very much real and very much paying attention. I attended that meeting not as a combatant but as an observer, curious to see how the transition would go and wanting to support Jennifer and the new board members, who had fought so hard to create positive change. The community clubhouse was packed with at least 100 residents, the largest turnout anyone could remember, and the energy in the room was electric with anticipation and hope. Jennifer called the meeting to order with a calm professionalism that immediately set a different tone from Patricia's imperious style, and she began by outlining the new board's priorities: transparency, community engagement, fiscal responsibility, and rules that actually made sense. About 15 minutes into Jennifer's presentation, Patricia stormed into the room with Gerald trailing behind her like a dejected puppy, and she marched straight to the front of the room demanding to be heard. Her face red with anger and what I suspected might be a few pre-meeting cocktails. Jennifer calmly informed Patricia that there would be a community comment period later in the meeting, where she was welcome to share her thoughts for the allotted 3 minutes per resident. But Patricia wasn't having it, launching into a tirade about how the community had made a terrible mistake, how she had dedicated 8 years of her life to protecting property values, how I was a con artist who had manipulated everyone, and how the new board was going to run the HOA into the ground within 6 months. The room sat in stunned silence for about 30 seconds before George Feldman, the new vice president and retired attorney, stood up and said in a voice that could have cut glass that Patricia was out of order, was no longer a board member, had no special privileges to interrupt the meeting, and needed to either sit down and wait her turn or leave the premises. Patricia turned her fury on George, calling him a senile old fool who didn't know what he was talking about, which was hilarious because George was sharp as a tack and had probably forgotten more about law and governance than Patricia had ever known. George simply pulled out his phone and said he was calling the sheriff to remove a disruptive trespasser unless she sat down immediately, and something about his calm certainty made Patricia realize she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She stumbled to a seat in the back row, muttering under her breath, while Gerald slunk out the door entirely, apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor. The meeting continued with Jennifer presenting a comprehensive review of the HOA's finances, and what she revealed was shocking even to me, who had assumed the old board was simply power-hungry rather than potentially corrupt. It turned out that over the past 3 years, Patricia had authorized over $85,000 in consulting fees to various companies, including a landscape design consultant that had charged $12,000 to recommend which flowers should be on the approved planting list, and a community standards consultant that had charged $18,000 annually to help enforce violations, which basically meant Patricia's friend Martha got paid to drive around looking for infractions to cite. There were also suspicious patterns in vendor selection, with the same companies winning bids for maintenance and repairs, despite not always offering the lowest prices. And it turned out that Gerald's brother-in-law owned one of these companies, a detail that had never been disclosed despite clear conflict of interest rules. Jennifer announced that the new board would be conducting a full audit and would be renegotiating contracts to ensure the community was getting fair value for its dues, and the room erupted in applause. Over the next few months, the audit revealed even more questionable spending, and while nothing rose to the level of criminal fraud, there was enough waste and favoritism that the board was able to cut the annual budget by nearly 20% while actually improving services, which meant they could reduce monthly HOA dues from $285 to $235. putting money back in residents' pockets. The transformation of the community accelerated rapidly under the new leadership, with Jennifer and her team implementing changes that seemed obvious in retrospect but had been unthinkable under Patricia's regime. They created an online portal where residents could submit maintenance requests, pay dues, access documents, and communicate with the board, replacing the old system where you had to physically come to the office during limited hours and deal with Sheila's passive-aggressive gait. They established regular town halls where residents could voice concerns and vote on major decisions, creating actual democratic participation, instead of the old system where the board made all decisions behind closed doors and then presented them as fait accompli. They revised the violation enforcement process to focus on genuine issues affecting safety and property values, rather than petty aesthetic complaints, and they implemented an appeals process so residents weren't at the mercy of arbitrary board decisions. They even organized community events that were actually fun: summer barbecues, holiday parties, a community yard sale, a Labor Day boat parade on the lake that became an instant tradition, turning the neighborhood from a collection of people who avoided each other to an actual community, where people knew and cared about their neighbors. My role in this transformation continued to evolve in unexpected ways, starting with my relationship with the dock system that had sparked the entire conflict. The joint committee we'd established to manage dock-related issues turned out to be genuinely useful, meeting quarterly to discuss maintenance needs, safety concerns, and potential improvements. I contributed not just as the owner but as someone with a software engineering background who could think systematically about problems, and I ended up designing a digital reservation system for the boat launch ramp that eliminated the Excel flicks that used to arise when multiple people wanted to launch boats at the same time. The system was simple: residents could reserve 2-hour launch windows through an app, ensuring everyone had fair access without the chaos of first come first served, or the arguments about who had been waiting longer. I built the app in about 3 weekends, made it free for all residents, and the improvement in launch efficiency and reduction in complaints was immediate and dramatic. This led to other residents asking if I'd be willing to help with other community technology needs, and I found myself volunteering to upgrade the HOA's website, set up the online portal Jennifer had envisioned, and even install a community Wi-Fi network in the common areas, so people could work remotely from the clubhouse or the picnic areas by the lake. I didn't charge anything for this work because I genuinely enjoyed it and because I'd discovered something surprising. I actually liked being part of a functional community where people worked together instead of against each other. The dock license fees continued to provide steady income, and I made good on my promise to use some of that money to improve the facilities. In the first year, I replaced the aging wooden dock sections with modern floating docks that were more stable and required less maintenance. I installed LED lighting throughout the dock area that made nighttime access safer and also looked beautiful reflecting off the water. I added a covered pavilion near the fish cleaning station where people could sit and socialize, and I purchased a dock sweeper machine that kept the walkways clean and free of algae. These improvements benefited everyone and demonstrated that the license fees residents were paying weren't just lining my pockets but were being reinvested in facilities they used every day, which built goodwill and reinforced that the arrangement was fair. Some of the most satisfying moments came from unexpected interactions with neighbors, who had initially been hostile or suspicious, but gradually changed their minds as they saw how things actually played out. There was Martin Kowalski, a retired police officer who lived about a quarter-mile from me and had initially been one of the angry callers accusing me of extortion, but who stopped by about 6 months after the dock agreement was finalized to apologize, and to thank me for standing up to the old board. Martin explained that he'd been fed up with Patricia's regime for years, but had felt powerless to change anything, and watching how I'd refused to be bullied had inspired him to get more involved in community affairs. He'd joined one of the new committees Jennifer had established, and was helping to revise the community's safety and security policies, and he said he was happier in the neighborhood than he'd been in years. There was also the Hen, a young couple with 2 small children who lived across the lake and who had been terrified when the dock situation first exploded because they'd just bought their house and couldn't afford to install a private dock if they lost access to the community system. They'd sent me a handwritten thank you note after the agreement was signed, expressing relief and gratitude, and over time we became friends, with their kids occasionally playing in my yard and me teaching their son Tommy how to fish off the docks. These small human connections accumulated over time, transforming me from that guy who caused all the drama into someone who was genuinely part of the community fabric, and it felt good in a way I hadn't anticipated when I first moved in expecting to be a bit of a loner, enjoying my lakefront solitude, but not everyone was happy with the new order, and Patricia's faction, though diminished, wasn't quite ready to give up their war. About 8 months after the recall election, I started noticing small acts of vandalism targeting my property, nothing catastrophic, but annoying and clearly deliberate. Someone dumped trash on my beach area 3 times in 2 weeks. My mailbox was knocked over twice, and someone spray-painted a crude insult on the fence that bordered the road. Thanks to the comprehensive security camera system I'd installed after the initial HOA confrontation, I had clear footage of the perpetrators, and I was genuinely shocked when I reviewed the videos because the vandals weren't Patricia or Gerald or Sheila as I'd half expected, but rather their adult children and some teenagers from their extended social circle who apparently thought they were defending their parents' honor or getting revenge on my behalf. I provided the footage to Martin, who still had connections in local law enforcement, and he ensured that the perpetrators were identified and charged with misdemeanor vandalism. The court ordered restitution for damages and community service, but more importantly, it sent a message that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. Patricia's daughter, who was in her 30s and should have known better, actually had the audacity to call me crying and begging me to drop the charges, because it would hurt her career if she had a criminal record. And I had to explain to her that actions have consequences, that her mother's vendetta against me had poisoned her judgment, and that I wasn't going to enable this behavior by letting it slide. The charges stood, and after that incident, the vandalism stopped completely, as if the reality of legal consequences had finally penetrated the bubble of entitlement that surrounded Patricia's circle. The second anniversary of my arrival at Serenity Lake Estates arrived without fanfare, but I marked it privately as a milestone worth celebrating because my life had transformed so dramatically from those chaotic first days. My property had appreciated significantly in value, not despite the dock controversy, but partly because of it. The formalized dock agreement actually made both my property and the neighboring properties more valuable because it provided legal certainty and protected access in a way that the previous informal arrangement never had. Real estate agents in the area were using the dock agreement as a selling point, explaining to potential buyers that they'd have guaranteed lake access for a reasonable fee that was far less than maintaining a private dock, and the neighborhood's reputation had shifted from being known for its oppressive HOA to being recognized as a well-managed community with reasonable rules and good leadership. I'd achieved the peaceful lakefront lifestyle I'd originally wanted, but I'd gained so much more: a real community, genuine friendships, the satisfaction of having stood up to bullies and won, and even a sense of purpose in contributing my skills to improve the neighborhood. My work-from-home software engineering career continued to thrive, actually benefiting from the peaceful environment and the mental clarity that came from morning kayak sessions and evening sales before starting my workday, and I found myself more productive and creative than I'd been during my Silicon Valley pressure cooker years. I'd also developed an unexpected reputation in the broader HOA reform movement, getting invited to speak at conferences and workshops about property rights and standing up to abusive community associations, and I'd been interviewed for several articles and even a short documentary about HOA overreach. Through these speaking engagements, I met other people who'd fought similar battles against petty tyrants in their own neighborhoods, and I realized that my story, while unique in its specific details, was part of a much larger pattern of HOA boards overstepping their authority and residents finally pushing back. I started consulting informally with people facing similar situations, helping them understand their property rights, connecting them with good real estate attorneys, and encouraging them to organize their communities to demand accountability from their boards. This became almost a part-time passion project, and while I never charged for this help, it gave me a deep sense of satisfaction to know that the lessons I'd learned through my own conflict were helping others navigate their own battles more effectively. One particularly gratifying case involved a woman named Sandra in a town about 60 miles away whose HOA was trying to force her to remove a vegetable garden from her front yard, claiming it violated aesthetic standards despite there being no specific rule against gardens. I helped Sandra research her property rights, connected her with James, my attorney, who took her case pro bono because he believed in the principle, and together we built a case that not only protected Sandra's garden, but resulted in a broader ruling that limited the HOA's ability to enforce vague aesthetic standards without specific, clearly written rules. Sandra's case became precedent that helped other homeowners across the state, and she sent me a basket of tomatoes and zucchini from her garden as thanks. which made me absurdly happy because it represented a real-world victory against the kind of petty authoritarianism that had tried to control my life when I first moved in. The third year brought a development that I never saw coming, but that ended up being the perfect conclusion to the saga. Patricia and her husband put their house up for sale and moved out of state to be closer to their grandchildren. Or at least that was the official story. The reality, which I learned through the neighborhood grapevine, was that Patricia couldn't stand living in a community where she no longer held power, where her former subjects had rejected her leadership and embraced a completely different vision of how the HOA should function, and where she had to see me regularly enjoying my property and the docks that she'd tried so hard to control. Every time she drove past the docks and saw the improvements I'd made, and the happy residents using the facilities, it apparently reminded her of her failure and her fall from grace. And eventually the daily reminders became too much to bear. Gerald had already left, and now Patricia was following, and while I felt no personal animosity toward her, I'd never wanted an enemy. Just to be left alone, I couldn't deny feeling a sense of cosmic justice in her self-imposed exile from the community she'd once dominated. Sheila stayed in the neighborhood but kept a very low profile, apparently having learned her lesson about the limits of HOA power and the consequences of abusing authority. The house that Patricia sold went to a wonderful family from Seattle, the Changs, who had 3 teenage kids and 2 very friendly golden retrievers that became neighborhood favorites. I made a point of welcoming them warmly to the community, stopping by with homemade cookies and a folder of information about the neighborhood, the dock system, the HOA, and local resources, because I wanted their first experience of Serenity Lake Estates to be the opposite of mine had been. Mrs. Chang, whose name was Diana, told me about a month after they moved in that they'd heard stories about the neighborhood's dramatic transformation and about my role in it, and she said she was grateful to be moving into a community that had learned to value cooperation over control. Her husband, David, became a regular sailing companion, and their kids joined the group of teenagers who had formed a summer tradition of cliff jumping at the far end of the lake, supervised by various parents, including me on occasion, creating the kind of multi-generational community bonds that make a neighborhood feel like home. As I write this now, sitting on my deck in the late afternoon sun watching boats return to the docks after a perfect day on the water, I'm struck by how a situation that started as a nightmare turned into one of the best things that ever happened to me. Yes, I could have avoided conflict by simply giving in to the HOA's demands, letting them push me around, and accepting that my property rights didn't matter. But where would that have left me? Living in a community where I was constantly under scrutiny, where petty tyrants dictated what I could do with my own home, where fear and control replaced cooperation and mutual respect. Instead, by standing firm on principle, by refusing to be bullied, by using the legal tools available to protect my rights, and by being willing to fight back strategically rather than emotionally, I not only secured my own peace and property but helped catalyze positive change for an entire community of 140 households. The dock fees I collect cover my property taxes and then some. The improvements I've made benefit everyone. The legal agreement protects both me and the community, and the new HOA leadership has created an environment where people actually want to live rather than simply endure. More importantly, I've learned lessons about standing up for yourself that have application far beyond property disputes and HOA conflicts. I learned that bullies only have the power you give them, that legal rights mean nothing if you're not willing to assert and defend them, that strategic thinking and calm preparation beats emotional reactions every time, that documentation and evidence are your best friends in any conflict, that finding allies and building coalitions can amplify your individual power exponentially, and that sometimes the right thing to do is the hard thing, the thing that creates short-term conflict but leads to long-term positive change. I learned that you don't have to be naturally confrontational or aggressive to stand up for yourself effectively. In fact, staying calm, being strategic, and maintaining the moral high ground are often more powerful than any amount of bluster or aggression. I learned that most people are fundamentally reasonable and will support fairness when given accurate information, even if it means turning against authority figures they'd previously deferred to out of habit or fear. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that you can create the life and community you want, but it requires the courage to resist forces that would control you, and the persistence to follow through even when the path is difficult. Looking back at those first chaotic weeks when Patricia stormed into my house making ridiculous demands, when Gerald tried to intimidate me by blocking my driveway, when Sheila looked at my property with contempt, and when the board threatened to make my life miserable if I didn't submit to their authority, I sometimes wonder what they think now as they watch from wherever they've scattered to, seeing the thriving community they no longer control and the peaceful life I'm living in the property they tried to dominate. Do they feel regret for starting a fight they didn't need to pick? Do they understand that their aggression and overreach directly caused their own downfall? Do they recognize that if they'd simply been decent human beings and approached me with respect, the outcome could have been so different? I doubt it, honestly, because people like Patricia don't usually achieve that level of self-awareness, preferring to blame others for their failures rather than examining their own choices. But it doesn't matter what they think anymore because they're irrelevant to my life and to this community, rendered powerless by their own actions and by the collective decision of residents who finally said enough is enough. The sun is setting now over Lake Serenity, painting the water in shades of orange and pink that never get old no matter how many times I see them, and I'm about to head down to my docks here. My docks, the ones I own and control and have transformed into a community asset while still maintaining my rights and receiving fair compensation. Meet up with David Chang and Martin Kowalski for an evening fishing session. Tomorrow morning, Jennifer and I are meeting for coffee to discuss some ideas she has for next year's community improvements. And tomorrow afternoon, I'm scheduled to do a video call with a homeowner in Oregon who's facing his own HOA nightmare and wants advice on how to fight back effectively. This weekend, we're hosting the 3rd annual Lake Serenity Boat Parade, an event that now draws spectators from neighboring communities and has become a celebrated local tradition. And I'm serving on the organizing committee alongside people who were initially suspicious of me but have become genuine friends. My life is full, my property is beautiful, my work is fulfilling, and my community is thriving, all because I refused to let petty tyrants control me and because I was willing to use every legal tool at my disposal to protect what was mine. The HOA stormed in right after I moved in thinking they could dominate me, threaten me, and force me to submit to their arbitrary rules. But they had no idea that I controlled their docks, that I had legal rights they couldn't overcome, that I possessed the knowledge and resources to fight back effectively, and that I had the spine to follow through when they tried to intimidate me. Their ignorance of these facts led directly to their downfall and to my triumph. And while I never wanted war, I certainly didn't lose the war they started. If there's a moral to this story, it's this: know your rights, document everything, stay calm when others lose their heads, build alliances with reasonable people, never back down from bullies, and understand that sometimes the best defense is a good offense, especially when you're holding cards your opponents don't know about. The docks were my ace in the hole, the leverage I needed to protect myself, and to force a change that benefited everyone except the tyrants who deserved to lose their power. And if I had to do it all over again, I'd make the same choices without hesitation, because living free on your own terms in a community that respects rather than controls you is worth any amount of temporary conflict, and the view from victory is absolutely spectacular.